All right, that one. Volume back on. And Alrighty. Okay, let's get started here and go for about an hour. So, how's the exam? Was that okay? Hopefully, not too many surprises. Okay, so we're going to jump in today, and we'll start here again on Wednesday. I'll say I hope to have the exam back to you on Wednesday. I should have time to work on it most of the day tomorrow, and if I don't finish it, I should have it done Wednesday morning. I don't have any other big things put into my schedule at the moment, so unless something comes up, I should be good to go, and I should have those back on Wednesday for you. And then again, if you want to, if you haven't taken a look at your first midterm and you want to, you just have to talk to me, and we'll set up a time, or after class. Obviously, it takes 5-6 minutes. And then the second one, once you get the grades back, if you want to kind of take a look at it, just let me know. And again, we'll book a time. I can do it through Zoom. I can do it in person. I can do it any number of ways. And I'm here a lot of the time. Okay. So today we're going to jump into talking about youth and crime, and get ready for some incredibly specific information, particularly about the Canadian youth justice system, because this is largely adapted from another course I taught, which is it's 321 Youth, Crime, and Society, which is one of our criminology classes. Let's jump in. Oh, right, the Slido. Not that anyone's been using it, but if you do want to ask questions, it's definitely there. Okay. Wait, these are questions from last semester, which I forgot to take out of this particular Slido. We'll just clear those. Oh, by the way, the answer to the question is for the final exam, which someone will probably ask, no, it's not cumulative. So it's just going to be crime, youth and health, and then the 3 modules on youth and technology. Okay, so I think I talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the course, about the youth criminal justice system and about some of the kind of ways that the state starts to change its behavior towards youth, kind of towards the end of the 18th and definitely through the 19th century, right? So again, what's kind of happening around this time, right? The end of the 18th century, so the end of the 1700s, you're getting the Industrial Revolution, right? Urbanization, lots of people coming into the cities from, the family farms or other places that they're towns, or they're no longer able to make a living, and moving into the big cities, especially in Europe. So places like London, Manchester, the big kind of cities of the American Northwest, right? New York, and then Midwest, like Chicago, Boston, all of these places, are urbanizing really quickly as they industrialize as well. One of the things that happens with this is, of course, people are moving there. They continue to have families, and especially in the kind of working class, right? They're often male and female parent are both working because, the family wage, the idea that, just dad can go to work and support the family won't be a thing for a long time, until well into the 20th century. And so you have a lot of young people kind of roaming around getting into trouble. And so you start to get, first, a vocabulary that starts to describe, some of the problems that they're seeing, right? So you get the term juvenile delinquent, right, or juvenile delinquency, used basically towards the end of the 18th century, and then sort of popularized, through the 19th century to describe, basically young people violating social norms, right? Violations of law by a person under the age of adulthood. By the 19th century, you get a bunch of different things happening, but basically, as it becomes a bigger and bigger problem, and the state starts to get larger and larger, right? Nation states really start to coalesce. governments start to take a bigger and bigger role in people's lives, and you start to form kind of institutions to deal with juvenile delinquency. So the first thing you get is a bunch of institutions that deal specifically with juvenile delinquents, right? So, or what we call young offenders now. So you get things like industrial schools, reformatory schools, and basically without a kind of legal framework, they start to create institutions, to get young people off the streets, right? So we talked about this at the beginning of the course. The residential schools, Indian residential schools in Canada are something kind of in this line as well, right? Seeing Indigenous young people as a problem to be solved, and they form an institution to do it. Although, that doesn't have to do with crime necessarily. But yeah, so you start to get, special systems. And then right at the end of the 19th century, you get the first kind of formation of a youth criminal justice system. So it starts in Chicago with the Cook County Juvenile Court. And then it kind of spreads out, from the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century into more and more places that start to kind of emulate this. Okay, so that said, it's not to say that prior to the end of the 19th century, the middle of the end of the 18th century, middle of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that basically there was no difference kind of legally between adults and kind of youth, right? You have a bunch of different sorts of legal principles in English common law, so that's the legal system that kind of obviously the UK, Canada, the United States, and any other kind of Anglo-American country are based on, right? It's what's called English common law. And under English common law, right, you've long had sort of basic principles of things like, children under 7 couldn't be convicted of offenses, right? Now they could be put in kind of, the precursors of things like foster care or reformatory schools or taken away from their parents, but they couldn't be convicted of an offense. Between 7 and 14, they were subject to a legal principle called Dolly in Capax, right? So this, like all good legal terms, is from Latin, right? It means incapable of doing harm. And basically, it's a sort of sliding scale, between 7 and 14 and kind of old English common law of saying like, okay, basically based on your age and therefore your level of sort of understanding of what you're doing, you're less culpable than an adult would be. And so, you can't be punished in the same way as an adult would for committing crimes. And Dolly in Capax in English common law goes back a really long time. You can kind of see, traces of it in the 15th century, right? It's been around, for an incredibly long time in English common law. So, right, long before, industrialization, there was already this sense that young people weren't as culpable under the law, and it's been kind of building in English common law for a really, really long time. So basically, under English common law, children between 7 and 14 couldn't be prosecuted or couldn't be fully prosecuted for committing a criminal offense unless it's contested by the Crown, right? So you'd actually have to have the Crown actively ask to deal with a person in this age group. Okay, so kind of, we still have this notion of Dolly in Capax in the youth criminal justice system today, right? Now, today it looks a little bit different. We've got those ages spread out a little bit more, and basically this idea of Dolly in Capax in some sense sort of goes from about 12 now. So under 12, you really can't be charged with a crime except in very extreme cases. And then 12 to about, your 18th birthday, you're subject to kind of a sliding scale or a spectrum of different kinds of levels of criminal accountability, right? Or the sense that, of how culpable you can be held, right? Okay, so basically, all of these basically make up levels of what's called diminished criminal responsibility. And this is just the idea that, young people, because, and it's changed in terms of its language depending on how much we know about development and how we phrase it. But today we think of it, right, like basically things like the prefrontal cortex. Young people's prefrontal cortexes, their decision-making centers, aren't fully developed. And so they aren't fully cognizant of the consequences of their action. Children chronically lack long-term thinking skills, like to see the consequences of their action, long-term, or on other people. And so we say that basically you shouldn't hold them to the same level of accountability as adults, right? So they can't be held fully responsible for criminal behavior, right? And we have, these are pretty easy to understand. We have 3 basic levels of criminal accountability under kind of Canadian law today, and it's similar in the US and the UK. So no criminal accountability. Obviously, this is judging the person is too young to be held criminally accountable, and this you would tend to see below the age of 12. Limited criminal accountability, so from 12 to 17, we judge that young people are still developing and some of that long-term thinking is not fully developed, so they have limited accountability. And then full criminal accountability for young people, right? So between 12 and 17 in Canada, it'd be very, very rare that you would have full criminal accountability. It's almost impossible now under current legislation, which is called the Youth Criminal Justice Act, to get a young person tried as an adult, right? It's essentially, it can happen in very rare legal circumstances, but essentially, I'm not aware of a case in the last 10 years where you've actually had, a young person tried as an adult in Canada, because it's almost impossible. So basically, we'd say for adults, right? Adults have full criminal responsibility, and in Canadian law, if you're 17 years old and 364 days, you fall into limited criminal accountability. Okay, although if it's 18 years in one day, you're out of luck. Okay, another kind of important legal principle having to do with young people is referred to as parens patriae. And this is basically a kind of legal philosophy that's the foundation of the child welfare system that we see in most industrialized states. And basically, so it means very literally like father of the country, but in legal terms, what parens patriae means is basically that the state has a responsibility to step in and assume kind of the responsibility of a parent or of a young person's parents, if they have no parents, or if their parents are unable to or inadequately discharging their responsibilities as parents, right? And this is still very much part of the legal system, right? If you see, Child Protective Services, basically is founded on this idea that the state has a responsibility, to its citizens to step in where parents are sort of falling down on the job, right? Now, if we go back to, sort of the 19th century, it gets phrased a little bit differently, right? But it's still basically the foundation of the youth criminal justice system, particularly in Canada, is this idea that, okay, if parents aren't doing their job of raising upright young people, citizens that can, that are following the rules, that have good morals and all of that, then the state needs to be stepped in. The state needs to step in. Okay, so how this kind of manifested, in the 19th century, amongst especially like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elites, right, who are the people running Canada, the US, right? It would have been, guys like John A. Macdonald and the people around him, the sort of founding fathers of Canada, were all kind of, what you call WASPs, or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? And basically, they had this notion that, one of the causes of juvenile delinquency in Canada was that these young people were misguided, right? That basically they were receiving poor moral formation from their parents, and that what had to happen, under parens patriae, was that basically the state, in some capacity, through the courts typically, needed to step in, provide a helping hand or friendly helpfulness to young people to get them back on the right path and correct some of the moral failings that had happened in the way they were being raised. So how this plays out, and I'll talk about the specific legislations in a second, but kind of early youth criminal justice legislation in Canada gave judges a ton of power over young people and for extended periods of time, right? And basically through a probation model, right? Young people were typically not incarcerated except in relatively rare circumstances, but through a probation model, they were kept under the supervision of the court, and they could be forced to do things like attend industrial schools or reformatory schools, for really long periods of time. And basically, judges were given a wide range of powers to do whatever they wanted with young people, to basically reform them in any way that they saw fit. Whether that was, sending them to what essentially was, a boarding school where they were taught industrial skills for 5, 6, 7 years, that was all up to the judge, right? Okay. Yeah, and generally, like I said, this was not incarceration. It was a sort of probationary model, but it could be, under the first piece of legislation we'll talk about in a sec, the Juvenile Delinquents Act. Basically, the judges had power on the young person until they discharged them or until that young person's 18th birthday. Okay. All right, so in Canada, it's a little bit different in every country, but we'll talk about Canada specifically here. And the US is a little bit different because every state sort of set this independently, right? And so in the US, you'd have to talk about all the different states and how they set these things up. In Canada, it's a little bit more centralized, so it's a little bit easier to talk about. Okay, so yeah, the first piece of legislation that governed basically young people in Canada, like the juvenile delinquents in Canada, was the Juvenile Delinquents Act. And basically, the Juvenile Delinquents Act was the law of the land from 1908 till 1984. So it's the longest kind of reigning juvenile justice legislation in Canadian history by a pretty extended measure. Now, in that period, obviously, the Juvenile Delinquents Act goes through a bunch of amendments, right? The government kind of tries to fix it up, patch up some of the holes they find in it over that period, but it remained the law of the land, for that period of time. And basically, it had some kind of basic legal principles, and then it devolved a lot of power to the provinces to sort of set their own agenda. So things like, maximum ages, like what was the maximum age of a juvenile delinquent? Most places set it at 17. A few provinces set it at 15, right? So beyond 15, you were considered an adult offender. You have to think, again, beginning of the 20th century, so a long time ago, almost a century. And yeah, it could be different for males or females. Male offenders were typically treated more seriously than female offenders. And the maximum ages for males tended to be older than females. Okay, so where did it come from? So it came from, there's a couple of people that are generally credited as the sort of architects of the Juvenile Delinquents Act. And they both basically come from kind of, Toronto, upper class, kind of white Anglo-Saxon communities in Toronto. So the first one is a guy named J.J. Kelso. So Kelso is a sort of socialite and journalist in Toronto. And basically, he became part of what's called the child saving movement in Ontario. Now, the child saving movement was something that kind of spanned kind of Anglo-America, right? So Britain, Australia, the US, Canada. And it was this sort of idea that the people in the kind of upper echelons of society had, that basically the problem with all of the kind of youth crime they were seeing, youth gangs, hooliganism, juvenile delinquency, was all down to morals, right? That basically young people were being taught poor morals and were being morally poorly formed by their parents. Now, in a lot of cases, what this actually amounted to was classism, racism, and anti-Catholic kind of bigotry, because a lot of these people saw, this is maybe a little bit more true in the US, but certainly happened in Canada as well, people like the Irish, right? And the Irish were broadly Roman Catholic, and basically they were really, really poor. They'd come over from Ireland with almost nothing, they had large families, they were quite poor, and the English had long despised the Irish for a bunch of kind of historical reasons, and basically, kind of looked down upon them. So, when they saw a lot of the children of the Irish or Italians or, Polish people who were committing crimes because they were poor and they were unsupervised because their parents were working in the factories all day, they basically said, look, these Catholics are teaching their young people poor morals. And obviously, right, this happened as well in the US with black people, black youth. Indigenous youth in both Canada and the US were tagged with the same sorts of labels. And basically it was like, what do we have to do? Well, we have to save, it's called the child saving movement because it's like we have to save children from the poor morals they're being taught by their parents, right? If we leave them alone, they're going to end up becoming criminals. So we need to teach them skills, and we need to teach them, kind of proper Protestant morality, and sort of, move them away from their terrible Catholic parents. So basically, you have this kind of social movement, and there's lots of movements kind of like this in this period, right? There's the, what is it called? The Temperance League, right? Where a bunch of kind of white upper class women are lobbying against alcohol consumption, right? And trying to convince government to pass prohibition laws, which does happen in the US, never happens in Canada. And lots of these kind of moralistic kind of groupings amongst kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant upper classes. And this just happens to be one of them. So basically Kelso, and he's pretty prominent. He's got, prominent positions. He writes as a journalist. And so they start to lobby for, Parliament for, an act for the protection and reformation of neglected children, and an act for the prevention of cruelty to and better protection of children, right? And again, there's some noble intentions here. I make it sound really terrible, like there's like this conspiracy, but there were some noble intentions here as well, right? They saw a lot of neglected children. Rates of domestic abuse amongst a lot of these populations were high. Alcoholism amongst their parents was not unknown. And so, they weren't always treated the best. So they're lobbying Parliament in Canada for legislation. And, Kelso basically claims to have been the one who authored the JDA. That is, however, incorrect. The actual author was this fellow, W.L. Scott. And inevitably, if you ask me this without my slides, I will mix up the names of the two people because Kelso and Scott sound exactly the same for some reason in my brain, and I've never been able to keep them straight. But Scott was basically a parliamentarian, and was the person who actually kind of put the legislation down. And Scott, did, I think the smart thing, and basically looked around for equivalent legislation amongst Anglo-American countries, right? Countries that followed British common law as their kind of legal basis. So particularly Scott, traveled across the Great Lakes to Chicago, and then also to one of the other kind of hotbeds of innovation in youth criminal justice, Philadelphia, and came back with a bunch of ideas for the Juvenile Delinquents Act, right? Okay, so yeah, the child saving movement obviously played a big role, like I've said. Other times, and this is where Kelso is really critical. He went over to, first Chicago to take a look at the Cook County Juvenile Court and the model they built there. And then he went to a kind of youth justice conference in Philadelphia where he consulted people like Judge Harvey Hurd, Judge Ben Lindsay, and heard about the Philadelphia probation model, which was a model that was basically designed not to incarcerate young people, right? To keep young people out of prison with this kind of child welfare model in mind, but that had these long periods of supervision. One of the things that's also true is that in this period, most of the Western developed industrialized nations are experimenting with youth justice systems, right? So, the French, the Germans, the Austrians are all kind of experimenting with things. And obviously Australia, you have a few ideas come in from Australia. So you have, a lot of our ideas came from the US, but the US itself was being kind of cross-pollinated with ideas from places like Germany and from France, right? They're all experimenting because they're all sort of facing the same problem at the same time. The welfare state is starting to be a thing, right? The kind of I would say more of a proto-welfare state at this point, where the state starts to take more responsibility for helping people, although the welfare state won't really be fully formed until the middle part of the 20th century. Okay. So, a couple of things that are in the that are really notable about the Juvenile Delinquents Act. Yeah, so it casts a really wide net, right? And basically, it defined juvenile delinquency very, very broadly and allowed, law enforcement and judges a great deal of discretion in dealing with juvenile delinquents. a couple of big kind of categories of it that it created, and some of them are still with us in legal terms. One of them is status offenses, right? So a status offense, right, an offense that youth could be found guilty of simply because they're underage, right? So basically things like underage drinking, in some cases like, because we're going back to the beginning of the 20th century, a different kind of era, sexual behaviors would have been classed here, truancy, so skipping school, right? Anything that, and today there's a whole class of status offenses, like if you're a young person and you do these things, right, then it's automatically a crime, right? So like just paying someone to purchase alcohol for you, right, would be a status offense because you're underage, so you're paying someone to commit a crime for you. Having alcohol, having marijuana now that it's illegal substances, these are all status offenses. Or truancy, right, not reporting to school without a reason not to do so, right? So, I mean, if you're ill, obviously, but if you don't have a good reason, the school board can report you for truancy, and there's still truancy officers that are part of social services that investigate claims of truancy by school. The other one, and I told you about this already, indeterminate sentences. The JDA basically, and this gets fixed in later legislation, didn't have kind of sentencing guidelines of any kind, right? So it wasn't like, okay, a young person for a first-time offense can only be sentenced to 1 year in prison or 1 year probation, right? And that's how the legislation today is structured. But then it was like the judge will determine how long the sentence is based on their sense of the young person, right? So basically, it allowed incarceration or a probationary sentence with no fixed expiration date other than the child's 18th birthday, right? Once they were an adult, then that term expired. But until you were an adult, you could basically, if the judge wanted to say, I still don't think you're fully reformed, they could keep you in a probationary sentence, basically more or less indefinitely. So basically 15 to 17, right? Depending on the province you were in and depending on whether you were male or female. But basically, you were, any child, any juvenile delinquent between 7 and 15 or 17 was under the Juvenile Delinquents Act. Okay, so the Juvenile Delinquents Act stayed in effect for a very long time. Now, what ends up happening, obviously, is that, in 1908, when it's passed, Canada is very much an industrializing country, right? So Canada, obviously, Canadian history, I hope, became a country in 1867, really, puts a push on developing. Canada was very underdeveloped, under British rule. And the Canadian kind of government in the early days puts a big push on industrializing the eastern part of the country and expanding west, right? And making sure that they have territorial claims, basically from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, always to keep the Americans out. That's a very different country, than the country in the 1950s, and then a very different country from, the 1970s and 80s, where, by the time you get to the middle part of the 20th century, Canada is one of the largest economies in the world, one of the 7 largest economies in the world. And then, by the 1980s, right, it's a fully industrial and leaning towards a post-industrial economy, right, and it's society, right? It's fully urbanized for the most part. And it's just a very different place. So basically, by the kind of late 1970s, early 1980s, there's a real sense that the Juvenile Delinquents Act is outdated, right? And it's been kind of patched up and things have been changed, but it was really outmoded in lots of ways. And so basically, in what's a pattern for Canadian justice legislation, the late kind of government of Pierre Elliott Trudeau starts working on a legislation to replace the Juvenile Delinquents Act. They basically bring it pretty much all the way to the finish line, and then lose an election to the Conservatives, who then have to implement the law. So it's principally implemented under, and I mean, you probably have no idea who this is, but Brian Mulroney, who basically governed Canada through a good chunk of the 1980s as a progressive conservative. Okay, so what does the legislation actually do? Well, one of the things that it does is it adds due process for young offenders. So in one of the weird things about the Juvenile Delinquent Act is that it actually didn't grant a whole bunch of due process provisions for young offenders. So among other things, under the Juvenile Delinquents Act, young people didn't have the right to a lawyer, right? So basically, and it was actually strongly discouraged that young people would bring a lawyer to court because it was seen, again, the Juvenile Delinquents Act was all about friendly helpfulness and the state being kind and helpful to young people. And so why do you want to get a lawyer involved in our friendly and helpful process? So there was no right to things like speedy trial, expedited sentencing, or legal representation. So most young people under the Juvenile Delinquents Act actually face, and especially since it was mostly targeted at the poor, faced the court without any legal representation. So you can imagine how that went. So it would only have been, the children of the wealthy, where parents could afford lawyers. There was none of this we have in the US it's under Miranda, but in Canada, I can't remember, but basically the right to legal representation, right? And if you can't afford a lawyer will be given to you by the court, by someone to represent you and represent your interests. That was non-existent under the Juvenile Delinquents Act. So most young people would have been facing the court, entirely devoid of kind of legal representation. And this changes under the Young Offenders Act, where it brings in these regular due process provisions, habeas corpus, and all of these things that allow, legal representation and reasonable sentencing for young people. Now that said, it was heavily criticized at the time for shifting away from that kind of child welfare sort of approach. The idea was that it was much more punitive, right? So amongst other things, like taking away this kind of probationary model, it replaced a lot of it with carceral sentences, right? So actually putting young people in prison and adding a lot of prison terms. Now, again, this is a reflection of the times. The crime that had started to emerge for young people in the 1970s and 1980s tended to be things like drug crime and violent crime. And so, there was a big push to kind of crack down on these things. And so basically, it was seen as a child or a crime control-based approach and a child blaming approach to criminal justice. And it proved to be a really unpopular piece of legislation overall. So critics, said it was a shift away from that child welfare base. It basically had more focus on accountability under a sort of punitive model of criminal justice, or a retributive model of criminal justice, this idea of making people pay their debt to society, than actually, helping the young person reform. And so it was heavily criticized. And sorry, I don't know if I have, do I have it on here? Okay, I'll talk about it here. This is one of those weird pieces of legislation that everybody hated. So it was widely seen by conservatives in Canada as soft on crime, right? Because it had brought in a bunch of really, basically provisions that were meant to protect young people and sort of safeguard their future, right? So amongst, the more unpopular aspects of the Young Offenders Act was the fact that they had a publication ban on the name of young offenders, right? So basically you couldn't publish the name of a young offender. And it also had shorter sentences for all categories of crime, including violent crime. And it made it really difficult to try a young person as an adult, even if that person was really close to the age of majority. And so you had some really prominent cases under the Young Offenders Act, particularly in the 1990s, of very violent crimes, right? Murders, violent sexual assaults, where, basically the name of the defendant was blocked from publication, so nobody knew who they were. Nobody knew the name. And relatively short sentences were given, maybe 5 years for first-degree murder, and even in some particularly brutal cases. And then, the media would speculate, right? Oh, well, with good behavior, this person could actually get out in 3 or 4 years rather than the full 5-year or 7-year term. And so, on the conservative side, they really hated it because they saw it as soft on crime, right? And so, right, in this comic from the era, right, there's a political cartoon, this kids murdered the old lady, and Brian Mulroney, the prime minister, is handing him a lollipop that says Young Offenders Act and saying naughty, naughty, right? On the more kind of liberal side of the equation in Canada, they thought it too punitive, right? That a lot of the sentencing was too punitive, and it was much more of a crime control-based approach rather than a reform-based one. And this is another comic from the era of the Young Offenders Act, right? Where these two people are talking about whether they're going to rob this guy, and he checks the statutes first to make sure that it'll be covered by the Young Offenders Act. So you can see it was, and this is towards the end of the Young Offenders Act era, where people were really pushing for reform. Okay, so basically, right, 1984 till 2003, the Young Offenders Act is in place. But by 1999, it's pretty clear that this legislation is super unpopular, and there's a bunch of flaws with it. And so the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien starts to work on replacing it with a new piece of legislation, basically that would kind of blend, in a sense, some of the best parts of the JDA and the Young Offenders Act. And this is the legislation that we have today, more or less, with one major amendment in 2008, I think, in an omnibus bill called Safe Streets and Communities Act from the Harper Conservatives. Basically, what you have is what's called the Youth Criminal Justice Act, which again is brought in kind of all the way to the finish line by the Liberals, and then left to the Harper government of the Conservative Party of Canada to actually implement. Okay, so it's similarly kind of controversial when it comes out. Criminologists, including a couple of them that we have on staff here, Brian Hogeveen in particular, are really critical of it, right? They start to kind of look at it, and they think, again, it kind of that shift away from a child welfare model to more juvenile justice, and more of a kind of blending the youth system with the adult system. I think that especially those early accounts and early worries were probably overblown. It's actually proved to be a really interesting and really useful piece of legislation. One of the most interesting parts of it is that it creates what's called a bifurcated youth justice system. And what happens with the Youth Criminal Justice Act is that about 80% of young offenders who encounter the youth criminal justice system encounter it once, right? And they are diverted from the system, right? So they don't ever go to court. They don't ever go to prison, right? Basically, they're diverted out of the system altogether through what are called extrajudicial sanctions or extrajudicial measures. And I've been teaching this for ever, and I still can't say those two. Too many syllables. So basically, 80% of young people encounter, who get arrested by a police officer or encounter a police officer after committing an offense are diverted, right? Either they get a police warning or a caution, or they get an extrajudicial sanction. And basically, that would be something like community service, or they have to go to drug treatment or counseling, or something like that. In some extreme cases, right, as part of the deal, especially in Quebec, which is a bit of a kooky place legally, their parents have to go and take parenting classes, which I think is always a fun one. It goes back to that sort of child-saving model that's still part of the legislation in some senses. And then, so for that other 20%, right? So the 80% that get diverted are usually, first time and less serious offenders, right? Petty crimes. More serious offenders and repeat offenders will get, channeled into the court system, and then often into incarcerated in some way, right? And this is typically, right, violent crime will almost always get you there. And someone for whom the court and the crown prosecutors look at it and it's like, okay, this person has been in contact with the police and maybe had a few, non-carceral kind of ways of dealing with them, and it's not working. So then, we're on to a kind of more carceral sentence. But most people get diverted from the system. Okay. I think, like I said, early kind of looks at the Youth Criminal Justice Act have tended to focus on how it potentially blended or either made sentencing more severe, made the system more kind of bureaucratic and centralized, or, basically led to more carceral sentences. I think for a lot of people were worried about adulteration, right? Basically getting rid of, breaking down a distinct youth criminal justice system and merging it with the justice system of adults, in a sense, going back to the days prior to the Juvenile Delinquents Act. I think most people now, like Tony Doob over at, I love his name for some reason. It's just fun to say. Tony Doob. Have ended up kind of in the place where, they view the Youth Criminal Justice Act overall in a positive way. It reduced the number of young people that enter the criminal justice system compared to the Young Offenders Act. And it's tended to lead to a reduced level of punitiveness overall. But there's still debates, right? And I mean, particularly Brian Hogeveen still views it with a bit of, I think, suspicion overall, concerned that it's actually over time leading to a more adultified kind of system for young people. Though I tend to come down with Doob and Sprott and thinking that it's a little bit less punitive. What am I doing for time? Oh, so much time. Okay, maybe not that much. Okay, yeah. So when we talk about like measuring juvenile delinquency in Canada, obviously we've had kind of different periods. And in general, right, we can kind of split it into, pre-Confederate times, so prior to 1876, when, basically Canada starts to gather its own statistics and it finally peels that off of the British. The period of state intervention, which is basically that early period from about 1850 till 1908, and then most of the 20th century. We really don't know, if we look at pre-Confederation, how much crime there was, because nobody was keeping statistics, because there was no really government of Canada. We were governed by the British, and the British, amongst other things, weren't that interested in keeping detailed crime statistics in Canada, because they had a big empire to govern. But basically what we know about pre-kind of Confederation crime in Canada comes to us from newspaper accounts. Right, basically people were writing in newspapers, right, that there were a lot of boys who were, represented in crime, that there was a lot of crime in urban centers, and that this tended to be a result of, family problems, parental deaths, and these sorts of things. Basically, pardon me, young people living on the streets in a lot of cases because they'd run away from home or their parents had died and they had no other recourse, so they turned to crime to support themselves. Like I said, the 19th century, right, is where we get a bunch of the reactions. I talked about this earlier in the course, right, and just a minute ago, the child saving movement starts here. But along with that, right, you get, pushes towards, this is where we talked about it, and there was a question on the first exam about it. Things like a push towards public schooling, right, getting young people into school so that you had them contained in a place and not roaming the streets and getting into trouble. And like I said, Scott and Kelso, had growing concerns with the root causes of delinquent behavior, which they put down not to poverty, because, the wealthy elites will rarely intune that the economic system that benefits them ultimately is the cause of the behavior. They put it down to, things like people being Catholic, and imputing or Indigenous or Black, and imparting poor morals to their children. The late 19th century, like right at the end, and the early 20th century, really is this moment where it all kind of comes together. Juvenile courts and the whole justice system really starts to keep statistics and careful measurements of youth crime in particular, right? And like I said, before like maybe 1780, people aren't even thinking about juvenile delinquency as distinct, right? The idea doesn't occur to them that juvenile delinquency is somehow distinct from, crime overall. And yeah, I mean, you get through the 20th century, you have these now changing patterns of juvenile crime, going from kind of the abandoned youth of the early industrial era to kind of the poor, the gangs, and kind of drug sales, and these sorts of things that start kind of mid 20th century. And I mean, I guess there's racketeering and alcohol sales during Prohibition that all young people take part in. But you just have these changing kind of patterns through the 20th century. And it kind of seen as under control in the beginning part of the 20th century. And as you move through into the 70s and 80s, basically youth crime comes to be perceived as a growing problem, right? As a bigger and bigger problem, especially, the news plays a big part in this when television comes in, especially in a big way in the 1960s, you get much more like the nightly news where people are seeing the results of crime. And as this kind of expands, there's more competition for news. There's more and more kind of talk about the problem of youth crime as people get more and more kind of visual representations of it, right? So yeah, by the 1960s and 70s, or 70s and 80s, right, big problem is perceived, and you get increasing amounts of youth crime legislation. In Canada, that's the Young Offenders Act and the Youth Criminal Justice Act, but if you went to Britain, they've got their own, and if you went to the US, right, it varies by state, but they've got their own as well. Okay, so generally speaking though, once we get past roughly 1989-ish, more or less, we've seen declining youth crime really up until a couple of years ago, right? So it declines pretty steadily from, that's my decline hand. It declines pretty steadily from about 1989, 1990, until roughly 2020, at which point it starts to tick up again. And now, we've seen increasing kind of youth crime really following COVID, and we're not entirely sure why altogether. But yeah, basically declined. Like if you look at the period between 1994 and 2009, it dropped by 47%. And basically, this is in line with kind of overall declines in crime across the board, right? Basically, from the late 1980s till, like I said, basically about 2020, you've had kind of steady declines in especially nonviolent crime, so property crime, for a really, really long time. Now, there's a bunch of different explanations that people proffer for this. I think probably the most likely one is, in response to some of, especially in the 1980s, to some of this discourse about crime being out of control. And it wasn't just youth crime, it was crime in general. I want to call it the carceral state. Maybe that's not the best description. Basically, like the law enforcement industrial complex grows enormously, right? Police forces get much bigger. Correctional services, so prisons and reformatory institutions get much bigger. Things like social workers and probation officers, all of that expands massively. So that suddenly, when you have more, oddly, one of the strange things that happens is for a little while, when you have more police officers, crime actually goes up because suddenly there's more police officers catching more crime. So it seems like in the 1980s, crime is going up, and then it hits about 1990, and 1989, 1990, it drops. And this is true across the board, right, for adult crime and for juvenile crime in general. In general terms, right, when we talk about violent crime, it's a pretty small percentage of juvenile crimes that are violent crimes. The bulk of them are property crimes, right? So breaking and entering, stealing from cars, typically often street-involved youth trying to support themselves. Other things like solicitation, so prostitution, are pretty common crimes as well. And then obviously, the sale of drugs being a big one for young people as well. 8%, only 8% of homicides in 2010, that statistic's a bit old, but I couldn't find a newer one, were committed by youth. And most youth crime tends to be youth on youth. Other kind of categories of crime that we often see are things like common assault, and people getting into fights. Even in terms of murder, the murder of young people by other young people, or murder of young people tends to be by other young people and often gang involved. Young people, young men in particular, between the ages of 15 and about 28, are at the greatest risk of committing sexual crime against other young people. It's just an age profile thing. If we look at the profile of sexual assault victims, it's 15 to 25 year old females, right? That's the bulk of the community that's sexually assaulted. Young people are at the highest risk of committing and being the victims of sexual crimes. Okay. So recidivism is a particularly kind of justicey term, but basically recidivism is your chance of reoffending if you have, basically been sent to prison, right? And basically, I guess if you committed a crime, because there's a lot of reasons the Youth Criminal Justice Act is structured the way it is. One of them is to reduce recidivism. Yeah, and basically in all three countries, recidivism is pretty high, especially amongst youth who are incarcerated, right? So if you go to prison, the chances that you are then going to commit a crime again are higher. The more times you are incarcerated, the more likely it is that you're going to become a career criminal. And the harsher the sentence, right? The longer a sentence you're given, the more likely, it increases your your chance of recidivism. Here it says about 3%. It's a little bit hard to quantify, but yeah, basically for like every extra year of a sentence for a young person where they're in a kind of carceral facility, you have a higher rate of reoffending. And I mean, the reason for this is generally pretty simple. For those of you who are sociologists, you probably heard this 100 times. But basically, one of the key things is, when you put someone into prison, you're putting them with a bunch of other criminals, right? And you break their social bonds to the outside world because you're suddenly kind of enclosed in what's called a total institution. And so suddenly they form really strong social bonds with other people who have exhibited very strong antisocial behavior. So the longer they're there and the more often, the more likely it is they form strong bonds with people who are, committing antisocial acts. And that will tend to put you on a pathway to career, like lifelong criminality or career criminality. What I want to do is make sure young people don't go to prison and don't, do anything like pretrial detention, because it's like the more you can keep them in the community and maybe shift them towards positive social bonds, right? It's like as part of your probationary sentence, you have to go to counseling, or you have to do community service, or I don't know, be part of this sports team or something. If you can build those pro-social bonds, less likely that they're going to reoffend, right? But if you put someone into prison, it's not a guarantee, but a really strong chance of reoffense because they come out of prison, their social bonds with all their friends and family have been broken and kind of severed for a period of time, and they've now formed, bonds with whoever they were in prison with. Okay. So racial profiling, and especially with young people, this has become a big concern, especially amongst, people of color, BIPOC individuals, whichever kind of term you want to use. And racial profiling, right? Obviously, we've had some really high profile instances, especially involving young people. And here, I think specifically of Trayvon Martin in Florida, who was killed by, I can't remember his name now. I can see his face, but I can't remember his name. Zimmerman? George Zimmerman. Okay, I was so close. You beat me to it. I'm like, I could see the face of them. Anyway. And then Michael Brown, who was killed by a police officer, whose name I have absolutely no idea. I'm sure I've heard it, but I can't remember. These are two really high-profile deaths of young African-American men in the U.S. But basically, one of the complaints of particularly young people of color in the U.S. and men of color or young men of color is that they're subject to racial profiling, right? And this, right, we know what it is when police or other security services, right, in a lot of cases like TSA or airport security or some such thing, pay disproportionate amount of attention based on race or ethnicity, right? And usually visible characteristics playing the biggest role, right? And I've got this, from Family Guy, the police officer's okay and not okay kind of color chart. It's a funny way of representing it. Probably the most famous kind of example legally of this is a policy in New York called Stop and Frisk, which was implemented in the 90s, right? And Stop and Frisk came at a particular moment in kind of US history. Crime was, like I said, especially high in the 1980s, and Rudy Giuliani became mayor of New York, and he appointed a new chief of police and sort of said, what can we do about crime? And basically, the policy of stop and frisk, the advocates of it suggested it should have been called stop, question, and frisk, because the police didn't just randomly stop people and frisk them right away. They often question them as well. But basically brought in this policy where the police were empowered basically to stop individuals they thought might be suspicious for some reason. They could question them, and if they had any probable cause to think that they might be carrying weapons or narcotics, they could pat them down. The other thing they typically did, and in Canada, the same policy is sometimes referred to as carding, where basically they would take their ID and run their name against existing warrants, right? To see if there were any existing warrants for this person. Now, why it's considered often I will go back to stop and frisk in a second. But, okay, so racial profiling is generally built on a particular policy or philosophy of policing that's called broken windows theory, right? And broken windows theory has a long heritage. Generally, don't say anything positive about it to sociologists or criminologists in this department, especially the grad students, because they're going to give you an earful about it. Which, I'm not an advocate of broken windows, but I'm like, oh yeah, I teach my students about broken windows, and I'll get 3 grad students telling me how broken windows is the worst thing in the world, and I know. But anyway, the grad students in this department are very enthusiastically anti-broken windows theory. But broken windows is a very kind of, so it's a very law and order kind of theory of basically how crime works. And basically what it advocates, and it's based on a couple, first off of an experiment, right? And basically they parked this car in a neighborhood and basically just left it and observed it and waited to see what happened. And when the car was intact, right, no windows broken, doors were locked, and all of these sorts of things, basically what they found was that the car, basically nobody messed with it. However, what they did then is they broke one of the windows of the car and then just left it there. And what they found was that when people saw a car with a broken window, well, they then further abused it. They would break into it, they would break the other windows, they would smash it up. And so this led to kind of a broad theory of how crime works, right? And the idea is, right, that signs of disorder, right? Whether it's a broken window on a car or graffiti that's left up or, a boarded up building that's nobody's taking care of, these are signs of disorder in a community, right? And that when there's signs of disorder, it leads to bigger signs, like bigger disorder, right? So if you have a broken down building or a broken window, then people will smash the rest of the car. If you have a building that looks dilapidated, homeless people will move into it, and it'll degrade the neighborhood, or people will start build a meth lab in it or something, right? I've gone to the extremes of broken windows theory. Now there's a meth lab in the abandoned building. I'm going Breaking Bad on you here. And then basically it leads to an escalating pattern of criminality as people see that no one is addressing kind of breakdown. So how this works, it tends to be, I think, more of a metaphor for how crime escalates than an actual realistic picture. But how it gets treated in terms of crime is that basically, and how it gets implemented, the idea is that if you're going to kind of lower crime in general, you don't let crime escalate, right? So you crack down on minor crime. So what happened in New York under stop and frisk is that the police were instructed to crack down on everything, right? So, because we're talking about the 1990s, if someone was walking down the street with a boombox, so a stereo that they would carry on their shoulders, it was powered by D batteries. So the thing ran for 5 minutes, and the D batteries cost a damn fortune. I remember these things. Never had one, but it's 6 D batteries. God, that's $80 in today's terms. Or people jumping, especially in New York, jumping the subway turnstiles, right? Trying to get on the subway train for free. The police basically crack down on these minor offenses. And what ends up happening in New York, right? So basically, and the idea is, if you don't let people get away with the little stuff, they won't escalate to bigger patterns of criminality. What ends up happening in New York is that crime does go down, right? In the 1990s, crime drops off. New York goes from a really fairly dangerous city to a really safe one. Now, that's on the advocates kind of side for broken windows theory. What the detractors from it will tell you is that, yes, crime in New York went down in the 1990s, but it also went down in places like Detroit and St. Louis, and neither of them had the same kind of approach. It was just a general reduction in crime. Okay, either way, how did it affect young people? Well, disproportionately young people are the ones stopped. Because one of the things that police officers know, because anyone who's looked at basic statistics will understand this, is that the profile for committing crimes, on the whole, most crimes are committed by people basically from about 15 to about 22, 23. After which point, it's not like it drops off sharply, but the number of crimes committed, kind of drops off because as people get older, they just commit less crimes, right? They get more established, they have kids or a job, and they don't want to put those relationships and life paths at risk. But that crime profile is about 15 to 22, 23. So the bulk of people stopped under stop and frisk, about in that age range, about 15 to 25. So yeah, if you look at a specific year, 2006, and this was statistics I took from the ACLU, or American Civil Liberties Union, about 500,000 stops, and about 90% of the people stopped were innocent, right? They were let go by police. But then, if we look at who was stopped, about over half were black. 29 were Hispanic, and only 11% were white. Half were age 14 to 24. I had it there. I set the range a little bit wrong. So how about half are 18 to 24? And then if you look at the category just above that, right, basically 25 to 30, the bulk of the rest of them are in there. It's hard visually to tell the difference between a 24-year-old and a 29-year-old. Unless you're like me and you were losing your hair already by 29, in which case it's probably pretty easy, but all right. Anyway, my hair-related problems notwithstanding. So this was hailed, like stop and frisk was hailed as bringing down crime. There's really good reasons to think that it probably didn't actually have that strong an effect, given again that crime dropped in other places that didn't have stop and frisk. But it's generally been held up as a solid policy. Now, advocates also will suggest, right? So, detractors will say that it's obviously a racist policy because of how many black and Hispanic people were stopped under stop and frisk. And this, if you had looked at any year of stop and frisk, it would have been pretty typically looked like this. But basically, advocates will suggest, well, New York in particular paired it with a system called CompStat, and computational statistics, where they basically matched police deployments to crime reports. And so basically, it just so happened, according to the advocates, that there were more crimes being committed and reported in black and Hispanic neighborhoods of New York City. And so that's where they put the police officers. So of course, they stopped more people of those kind of ethnicities. Right now, what is it? I think it was only about 13% of New York's population that was black, and yet 53% of the stops were of black people. It was eventually actually found to be an unconstitutional policy by the U.S. Supreme Court. I want to say in 2016, but I could be wrong about the year. So actually, it's no longer, this kind of racial profiling is no longer allowed. But it clearly, especially in the U.S., had a long-standing effect on young people. And we see the same kind of thing in Canada, right? I know in Toronto, in particular, Indigenous and black youth frequently complain about being stopped by Toronto Metro Police and carded, right? Asked for their identification. And then, it's checked if they have any warrants or anything like that. Just walking down the street in downtown Toronto at a pretty disproportionate rate. And in Canada, carding is still legal. It hasn't been found unconstitutional. All right, I'm 1 minute from being out of time, so I'm going to stop because this is a good place to stop because this is a new topic here. All right, let's pick it up there. I made it about a little more than halfway. We'll finish crime next time, and then we'll start on health. I got a lot of very happy mental health statistics for you. All right.